Bueno, buenos días, buenas tardes a todos y todas. Sé que algunos todavía se están sumando, pero mientras se van sumando los demás, voy a tomar solo 2 minutitos para contarles algunas novedades y ya después los dejo en manos excelentes de Marcelo y Fernando y dos oradores espectaculares, a los que les pido disculpas porque estoy armando todo esto en castellano, because I'm sorry to speak in Spanish because the audience is more Spanish, and I know you will speak in English. So I'll take only a couple of minutes, okay? Sé que muchos de los que se suman a esta reunión conocen lo que es la asociación, pero tal vez hay alguien nuevo, y entonces les queremos contar que esta reunión de hoy es parte de las reuniones de comisiones de estudio. Esta es la de la Comisión de Gestión de Fraude Corporativo, de la Asociación Argentina de Ética y Compliance. La asociación es una asociación sin fines de lucro y su objetivo es promover la adopción e inspirar el uso de las mejores prácticas en materia de ética y cumplimiento, entendiendo que las prácticas organizacionales tienen que ajustarse a las normas y regulaciones aplicables, así como a los principios éticos y de buenas prácticas de gobierno, control y transparencia. Nosotros decimos que nuestro lema es: lo correcto debe primar sobre lo conveniente, y en realidad lo que somos apasionados por hacer lo correcto. La asociación, además de tener las comisiones de estudio, tiene una certificación internacional en ética y cumplimiento que la damos en la Universidad de UCEMA. Tiene más de 20 ediciones y más de 1850 graduados. De hecho, se acaban de graduar 200 más, así que acabamos de pasar la barrera de los 2000. Tenemos 11 comisiones de estudio, como les decía. Esta es la de fraude corporativo, perdón, gestión de fraude corporativo, pero también tenemos comisiones de behavioral compliance, de data privacy y ética digital, de compliance y antitrust, de compliance en la industria financiera y seguro, de compliance penal estratégico, de compliance en el sector público, compliance en salud, gestión del fraude corporativo, sistemas de gestión de compliance, compliance y sostenibilidad, ASG, y una comisión de proyectos especiales. Así que los invitamos también, si quieren anotarse y formar parte de todos estos. Tenemos un club del Compliance Officer en donde participan todas las personas graduadas de la certificación, graduados SEC, y la asociación también tiene una iniciativa que se llama Connecting Dots, que es una suerte de bolsa de trabajo donde se pueden anotar tanto para postear un trabajo como para postularse a una de las ofertas que haya. Y también tenemos una iniciativa muy linda que llamamos Supervalores, en donde la asociación va a los colegios, entendiendo que promover valores no solamente es algo dentro de nuestro propio grupo, sino que tenemos que ir a las generaciones más nuevas. Así que vamos a los colegios y trabajamos con chicos de quinto, sexto y séptimo grado, chicos de entre 10 y 12 años, precisamente para trabajar en valores a través de juegos y de actividades. Tenemos también, todos los años desarrollamos el encuentro entre sector público y privado para discutir de compliance. Llevamos 12 encuentros organizados y 8 congresos internacionales. Dicho todo esto, los invitamos por supuesto a seguirnos en redes y en nuestra página web para enterarse de todas las novedades. Y ahora sí los dejo en manos excelentes de Marcelo y Fernando. Y gracias.
Muchas gracias, Mariana. Bueno, seguimos en español unos breves minutos para introducir. Primero, tengo la verdad el placer de coliderar esta comisión con un amigo, Marcelo Ovejero, abogado de Holland Knight, tanto en Argentina como en Estados Unidos. Y en mi caso particular, soy Fernando Peyretti para los nuevos en la comisión, socio de Forensics de Deloitte. Y hoy trajimos a dos colegas que la verdad tienen mucha experiencia en el desarrollo de investigaciones y en temas de compliance de mucha complejidad. Yo lo voy a presentar a William Devaney. William es abogado, es uno de los responsables a nivel internacional de investigaciones del estudio Baker Mckenzie, abogado en Estados Unidos, con un LLM en la Universidad de Cambridge. Y Marcelo, ¿nos querés introducir a Willy?
Claro que sí, gracias Fernando, buenas tardes a todos. Bueno, me toca presentar a un gran amigo con quien tengo el gusto de trabajar hace muchos años, Willy Ferrer. Es de Miami, es actualmente socio de la firma Holland Knight, en donde trabajamos juntos. Willy lidera nuestro equipo de compliance e investigaciones globales, en el que asistimos a muchos clientes con temas de derecho penal de alta gama, compliance e investigaciones internas. Previo a sumarse a Holland Knight, y esto también habla de la experiencia de Willy. Willy trabajó en el gobierno federal de Estados Unidos muchos años, particularmente en el Departamento de Justicia, donde fue por 8 años durante la administración del expresidente Obama, el jefe de los fiscales federales para el Distrito Sur de la Florida, que es la tercera oficina de fiscales federales más grande del país. Fer, si te parece bien, ahora cambiamos a idioma inglés para hacer un poco de respeto a nuestros oradores y empezamos con las preguntas. Dale.
That's perfect, Marce. Please go.
Okay, great. Well, so today we have organized this webinar to talk about an announcement that the U.S. Department of Justice made a couple of months ago about a pilot program concerning whistleblowers. And it's very interesting because we were going to talk about something that was an announcement up until 3 hours ago, where we learned that the Department of Justice actually rolled out the rules for these programs, so this webinar cannot be more timely, if you will. So let me start with a question for Willie. And before we get into the specifics of the Department of Justice announcement and the specific rules that they have laid out for this program, whistleblowers are a very particular character and play a very important role in the U.S. legal system, especially in the area of corporate law enforcement. Now, in contrast, and until quite recently, whistleblowers have not had such a prominent role in the legal systems of other parts of the world, including in Latin America and in Argentina. For this reason, and basically to illustrate this audience, Willie, can you please explain what is a whistleblower and the way in which U.S. law governs its existence?
Absolutely. First of all, real pleasure to join you and Fernando and the very talented Widge in this presentation. Very happy to be with you all, and again, ask questions along the way if that would help. So, very good question, Marcelo. What is, under the U.S. federal law, a whistleblower? Well, there's actually no one definition of what a whistleblower is, and the reason is because if you look at the federal statutes, there's approximately around 30 different mentions of whistleblowers in our federal law. And that makes it very interesting in trying to figure out what exactly that means. There's a lot of different programs in the federal law that sort of captures different types of protections or incentives for whistleblowers. So very generally, a whistleblower, or in Spanish, un denunciante, is at the end of the day a government witness that is going to provide the government with information about a potential crime. So an employee, a consultant, someone that has information about a crime that goes to the government. Also, what's important about what a whistleblower is in the government and federal law is it's really whoever goes in first. It's whoever goes into the government, number one, and is the first one in line saying, I saw this federal crime. That's a whistleblower. If someone comes behind them, they may be a denunciante, whistleblower, but they're not going to be as recognized under federal law. Now, despite the differences among all these different programs, I think it's easy to look at them, grouping them in two categories, two types of programs for whistleblowers in the United States. One is the protection programs that exist. What that means is when a whistleblower comes forward to the federal government and says, I've seen some bad going or some violation of the law, the company is prohibited from firing them, from retaliating, discriminating, demoting them. There's a lot of what they call protective activity, and you would have to look at that. An employer needs to be very, very careful. I saw a case once where the company found out that an employee had gone to the government, and it was done anonymously. So the company did not know who the whistleblower was, and the company started an internal investigation to find out the identity of the whistleblower. That's a big no-no. And it got that company in huge trouble once the government found out. So, and you got to also be careful, because if an employee is found to have been retaliated against, that employee can then go after the company. They can get back pay. If they get fired, they can get back pay. They can get reinstated back into the company. Imagine that. And damages. So litigation costs, attorney's fees costs, if you go after an employee or do anything that can be seen as retaliation. So when I think about, protection programs, just make sure that these programs are very different than what we're talking about today, which is an incentive program. So that what we're talking about today is a program that DOJ has put forward, incentivizing, motivating employees and whistleblowers to come forward. Why? Because the purpose of the program that was just rolled out today, the corporate whistleblower program, they want to encourage employees or other people related to the company to come to the government. And how are they incentivizing? Money. This program, under the whistleblower program, if the information given leads to a prosecution where they're able to get penalties and forfeitures over a certain amount, now the employee can get a percentage. And this is very similar. The reason they're doing this is because there was a gap in some of the programs. Right before today, there were basically 3 programs. The SEC had a program for whistleblowers, but for that, you need to be an issuer, right? You need to be a company that is on, registered in the stock market, and that's the SEC's jurisdiction. Insider trading cases, they have a whistleblower program, a huge one. Actually, just a couple of days ago, they paid a whistleblower $37 million. $37 million on July 26. You had the CFTC has a whistleblower program for violations of trade and consumer protection laws. So deceptive advertising, for example. And then the third program is the IRS whistleblower program. And that's, tax evasion, those kinds of programs. So under these 3 programs that existed before today now we have 4 with the DOJ corporate one, a whistleblower can come in. If the penalties that were recouped based on your tip and your information was more than $1 million, you can get 10 to 30% of those recoveries. So that's a lot of money. And then the other program that also exists, many of you may know, is the False Claims Act, which is a civil remedy. You hear them as called KETAMs or whistleblower actions, and those are actions that a whistleblower goes to the government and could bring against the company on behalf of the government for claims, false claims, and fraud against a government program. So it could be not paying customs duties, Medicare, deceiving Medicare or any other government program. So same thing, you can get 10 to 30% there. So that's Marcelo, sorry for the long answer, but that's a overview of how I see, the different whistleblower programs and what a whistleblower is under the eyes of the federal laws.
Thank you so much, Willie, for all that introductory information. Really useful to have a landscape of the situation right now. And I have a question for which. So today we are talking about a specific program, but if you have to think and look into the past about the measures of the DOJ has taken in the last few years to encourage voluntary disclosure. So what do you think were the most important ones that are now putting a program in place, but it's part of the story that the DOJ is trying to encourage people to talk and reveal information?
Thanks, Fernando. That's a great question. And first of all, hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today and to be on a panel with such noted panelists. taking a look at this in context, really taking a step back, is what DOJ is trying to do, obviously, is encourage companies to voluntarily disclose, to self-report themselves, right? And so they have a number of carrots and sticks to do that, right? To try to, on one hand, provide incentives, on the other hand, show that if you don't do this, there's, potentially more trouble for you down the road. And so over the last several years, they have really done a lot, particularly, I think, on the carrot side. If you take a look at the corporate enforcement program, which applies in FCPA cases, but also all cases involving corporations coming before DOJ, for the fraud section at DOJ, they started with if you voluntarily disclose, right, and you fully cooperate and you fully remediate, you have the potential to get a declination with disgorgement of ill-gotten gains. If you fully cooperate, you can still get up to 50% off of the bottom of the guideline range, which is how criminal penalties are calculated. DOJ sweetened that a little bit recently. Okay, if you voluntarily disclose, but you missed it, or there are aggravating circumstances, or you're a recidivist, you can still get a bit more. If you fully cooperate, you can still get a bit more. And so they're trying to create, more incentive for more companies to come in and voluntarily disclose. Sort of more on the stick side of that, right? What you're seeing is in a couple of measures. It begins back on the SEC side for issuers, as Willie was saying, the Dodd-Frank whistleblower provisions that you see, okay, you can get a monetary reward if you blow a whistle on a public company for having violated the securities laws. Then you've got self-disclosure programs that began with kind of main justice, right? Extended into the U.S. attorney's offices. Then you've got voluntary disclosure programs, which now extend into people. Individuals can come in and say, I've been engaged in wrongdoing with other co-conspirators, or in particular, potentially within my company. And they can get a non-prosecution agreement under certain circumstances for having brought that information. And today there's now, as Willie was saying, filling a gap. There's now this potential for a reward for coming forward. Now, again, what DOJ is trying to do there is increase the risk landscape for companies. So if a company finds out that something, is amiss, that a crime may have been committed within the company, and the company is weighing whether or not to voluntarily disclose, previously public companies for a long time, for the last at least decade, have had to think about, okay, is there a whistleblower out there? Will that whistleblower beat me in? If you weren't a public company, there wasn't that same sort of whistleblower pressure necessarily, because there was no real mechanism. I mean, citizens could always kind of like call up DOJ and say, hey, I've seen this crime. But now they're trying to create an incentive and also create a higher risk environment for companies not to voluntarily disclose. So now companies have to factor this into their kind of cost benefit analysis of a voluntary disclosure, right? One of the risks they have to factor in is there a whistleblower out there? Or did we hear this through a whistleblower, and are they going to beat me to DOJ? And if they beat me to DOJ, I can no longer receive a declination with disgorgement of ill-gotten gains. I need to perhaps get in there before the whistleblower. So it's all done to try to encourage companies to come in. And it creates a more dynamic landscape, I think, for that voluntary disclosure decision.
Excellent, which and just you and Willie mentioned some of this, but if you want to emphasize some differences and things that could be a different approach in this program in respect to the previous ones that we know, which kind of things do you like to re-emphasize?
Well, I think, first of all, there was no mechanism within DOJ. There was no monetary reward, right? There was no incentive for people to come in and blow a whistle to DOJ. I mean, basically what they got was a thank you very much. You know, different at the SEC, as I mentioned, for the last decade, only a couple months old, maybe up to a year old, different potentially for individuals. So again, so that's really, I think, the main difference here, where there's also going to be a difference for corporations internally is to make sure, and I always hesitate to say this because every client alert ends with, you better get your compliance program in order, right? And that's becoming a little trite. But here, it's not so much the entire compliance program, although that's a really good thing, but you want to make sure in your organization it's that potential whistleblowers feel enabled to take this up internally, whether it's with their supervisors or through the whistleblower hotline or to the compliance department, that they feel that they know how to do it, they feel enabled to do it, and they feel safe, coming back to some of the points Willie was alluding to. Because most whistleblowers statistically will first take it to their company. And only when they feel that they're not being heard, do they then take it to the government. So I think, you know, in terms of also looking at this in a more broader context, making sure that you have an effective internal whistleblower program actually lowers the risk that people will go to DOJ or they'll go to the SEC if you're a public company. But Willie, I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yes, no, you just touched on something that I saw so often when I was at the Department of Justice, like Marcelo said, for over 20 years. Whenever we got a complaint from an company employee that brought a whistleblower, again, what's called a key tam investigation, which is them coming to us and asking the government to file a claim because their company filed something falsely with the federal government, we always asked them why they came to us, right? And to Widge's exact point, I would say 8 or 9 times out of 10, we would hear from people saying, we tried to go internally. They ignored us, or they demoted me. They fired me. We've had many. So what that taught me was like, oh my goodness, if these companies would have simply created a culture, as Widge was saying, of taking complaints seriously and then finding a way to do it, you know, that's reasonable, to let every other employee know in the company that things have been addressed or discipline has been, you know, taken. Let's say that there was a real bad actor, a manager that was doing something really bad, and the employees there really feel that the company listens to you, respects you. A lot of them don't want, or didn't back then, go to the government, didn't want to. It's a lot of work. But then they heard that under a key tam, you can make some money. Now it's expanded. Now what the Department of Justice has done is not limited this just to cases where there's been a false claim against the federal government. In this new in this new whistleblower program, they are now targeting 4 new areas of corporate fraud. I don't know if you want me to get into that now, but we can whenever you tell me when. But now there's 4 new areas of fraud that they have asked whistleblowers to come in and speak to the government about.
I think, and previously to Marcelo, start with a new question, and especially because we have here a lot of people from Latin America that used to work in compliance, and thinking that we have like new regulations in the region in general. In the case of Argentina, is 2018, the anti-corruption local regulation, and how important is to have real ethics lines, no retaliation policies, and compliance in general. So for all that companies that are like hesitating, we are going to see right now that there is a very good incentive to start thinking about compliance and as some strategic point of any business right now, because DOJ is pursuing that. Thanks, Marcelo, for this minute.
Sure. No, that's great. Going back a little bit to something that Which said before, Willie, and DOJ has been saying this, you know, their approach to corporate enforcement is about carrots and sticks. For those who, in Latin America and Argentina, who are not familiar with that expression, carrots means good, we're giving you an incentive to, play nice, some sort of benefit in exchange, where the sticks is something that it's bad. We're going to punish you, which was saying before, for not doing it. So, when you, the new whistleblower program, to me, it falls more on the stick side, because it's telling you, company, if you don't come and self-disclose something wrong that has happened, maybe somebody else is going to do it, and that's going to be, this is going to play against you, right? At the same time, though, as Which was saying before, DOJ has a policy under which companies can get enforcement benefits if they self-disclose. So, Willie, you see, the tension, right? Where, on one side, you're telling whistleblowers come in and provide us information, and on the other hand, they're telling companies do the same. Now, when announcing the whistleblower program, importantly, DOJ said it is important to be the first on the door. So if you're a company self-disclosing, you want to get enforcement benefits like a declination or a lower fine, you need to come before a whistleblower. But at the same time, they're telling whistleblowers, you need to come before the company does and give us information if you want that cash reward, right? So they're creating sort of like a race to DOJ's door. Willie, do you see any downsides or concerns in DOJ creating this race?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. And this is going to be something that we're going to be paying a lot of attention to as to how this gets rolled out. And like you said, there is going to be, I'm assuming there's going to be some tension here, or some corporate executives worried now because, like you said, and by the way, for all of you who are listening, go look at the release the press release from Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco, and then the head of the criminal division, Nicole Angiteri, that came out today with this announcement, because they are very clear about who is first in the door. So a couple of things about that. What's interesting is that when the company comes in self-disclosing, right, the government is not does not have to tell them, and typically doesn't tell them whether they already heard this from somebody else. Sometimes they will. I mean, they usually will. They'll say, listen, thank you so much for your information. And then eventually you hear that you weren't first. So this is going to be this is the most difficult, and I'm sure Widge will agree with me, one of the most difficult issues we have as attorneys advising companies is whether to self-disclose. And one of the key factors in determining that is the government going to find out? Now there's a higher chance, because now that once people hear that they can go right directly to the government and get a monetary, a reward, that's gonna make companies very skittish and nervous about, oh my goodness, if we wait too long and then we disclose, it may be too late. And the government has already shown in different cases as of recently that if you wait a couple of months and you go, that may be deemed to be too late. The government can find out about what's going on through whistleblowers. They do a data analysis. They have a lot of mechanisms in figuring out whether something is happened or not. So imagine, because what Widge said was it was voluntary self-disclosure. What does voluntary mean? DOJ has been very clear in its compliance evaluation sort of criteria that if you are under imminent threat of disclosure, in other words, if you find out that someone is going to the government and then you say, no, wait a minute, we were going to tell you, that's not going to be deemed as voluntary. Now, you'll still get some credit, but it's not going to be full credit. Remember what Widge said, that you can get either full credit, which is a presumption of declination, which means the company doesn't get charged. But there are some cases that I've seen now that if you cooperate, but you really didn't disclose quickly enough, you can still get a break. You'll get either a non-prosecution agreement or a deferred prosecution agreement. But in those agreements, you have to admit to criminal conduct. So So Marcelo, there is going to definitely be a tension here because there's going to be now a race. It's going to be an evaluation about was the company really under an imminent threat? And there's going to be a lot of doubt from a company as to whether or not they should go forward or not. If they feel that they're not going to be first because a whistleblower is going to go in first, then there may be a reluctance to self-disclose to some degree, and that's going to be a little interesting. But I want to highlight something that was announced today by the Department of Justice, which is an amendment to the corporate enforcement policy that we've all known up to now. What the Department of Justice has said today is that if a whistleblower goes internally and tells their company managers that there's a violation of crime, okay? If the company goes and discloses within 120 days before the government finds out, okay? So in other words, if the company comes forward and reports the misconduct to the Department of Justice within 120 days, and before the department reaches out to the company, you could get the ultimate benefit, which is a declination. Unless I'm sure, and you've got to fully cooperate and you got to do all this other stuff that Widge talked about. But now the department is giving the companies a deadline. So again, this is just something we'll have to see how it all plays out. If you're a company executive, you get a complaint internally. You don't know if that whistleblower is going to go to the Department of Justice. You just don't. You're hoping they don't. But now the government is saying you got 120 days to figure it out. So this is now going to put some pressure on companies to figure out, okay, what do we do now? Do we solve it just internally and hope the whistleblower doesn't go to the government, or do we go and self-disclose? Because now that this program is out there, which is exactly what the department wants, right? This is as you said, it's an incentive program to get the company to go forward, because I'm like, oh my goodness, now that we're alerted and the whistleblower knows that they can go and get some money unless we're first, right? If the company beats the whistleblower. So imagine what that's going to cause in terms of a lot of late night meetings for Widge and myself and others that are in this business with our clients.
I was going to say, luckily it means a lot of work for us. But I'm also glad, Willie, to hear that, because it means that DOJ have thought about, because when they made the announcement, the white collar bar, and as Widge probably knows too, was kind of concerned about, what happens when the whistleblower comes internally. Does that mean that there's going to be an imminent threat of disclosure? And then if the company decides to self-disclose in response to that internal report, is it not going to be deemed voluntary? Because at the same time, DOJ is incentivizing companies to have compliance programs with reporting mechanisms where you take this internal report seriously. But, the concern was, if the whistleblower comes and we take it seriously, then it might not be voluntary, and we may lose the possibility to get that full credit that you were talking about, right? So it's good to hear that DOJ have thought about that tension and has come up, for good or for bad, with some sort of rule about that, which is a 120-day rule. Ferrer, I think you have another question, interesting question for Widge here.
Yeah, and previously I kind of was thinking about that during 2023. If we think in Dodd-Frank, there were 18,000 complaints by using that program. So if we think forward in this DOJ program, that is going to be really interesting about what companies are going to be doing. So question for Widge. When making the announcement, DOJ expressed the view that whistleblowers pilot program will drive companies to invest further in their own internal compliance and reporting systems. And we assume DOJ is mainly referring to a company's mechanism for misconduct to be reported and protocols to conduct internal investigations. What are the DOJ's expectations in these regards? And more importantly, even if the reporting mechanism and internal investigations protocols meet DOJ's expectation, how is a company expected to safely contain whistleblowers when DOJ is offering them money to come forward? For instance, can companies even offer higher monetary rewards to whistleblowers? What do you think this is going to be impacting in companies from that point of view?
Well, a lot of interesting points in there, Fernando. I think you mentioning the 18,000 or some total whistleblower complaints under Dodd-Frank, I think just demonstrates that this may create a different environment in companies, because a lot of whistleblowers will come to the company, they'll come to the government, but there's no there, right? They'll say, I saw my boss out with the deputy minister, and it could be the boss's job, right? And so he's definitely bribing this guy. While you do an internal investigation, you decide to say nothing. Government may then come to you, right? You have to be ready to address that. And one of the things, I was looking at some articles before our conversation today, and one of the statistics I thought was really interesting is tying into your 18,000 in Dodd-Frank. Of those, 2,387 of those were FCPA whistleblower complaints. Out of that 2,387, only 10 have led to SEC enforcement actions. So, and more will have led to investigations. They didn't have that number, but that's just kind of interesting to show that there's, in the dynamic environment of internal whistleblowing, and is there any real there? Couple other things that you said in terms of incentivizing compliance. Well, one of the things that recent amendments to DOJ's corporate enforcement program as well, you're going to be, one of the things that DOJ is going to assess is, are you rewarding employees for good compliance, and are you essentially fining them, including potentially clawing back compensation for not either violation of the company's policies or the laws, or as a manager not having a good compliance program in place. Part and parcel to that, I believe, is what we were discussing a little earlier, is going to be, does a company have a effective whistleblowing mechanism? Are they not retaliating against employees within that world? Some of the other things that DOJ is looking for these days is that I think it touched upon clawing back of salary and incentives where possible. Much easier to do in the United States than in most places outside the United States, where employment is very contractual. It's very difficult to take employment action in many other countries. But also, and I've heard a lot, and even in cases where you wouldn't expect this to be asked, I've been asked recently, particularly by the SEC, but also DOJ, about ephemeral messaging, things like WhatsApps, right? Zalo in Vietnam. And if you think of it, one of the reasons why is, when I was an assistant U.S. attorney, many levels below Willie, in a different office, and many years ago now, I was like, how did anyone make a case before emails, right? Here it is. It's all in their emails. How did people do this in the 80s, right? And now it's gotten to the point where people are smart enough. They don't put a lot of incriminating conversations in emails anymore. It's all on chats. It's all outside of the systems that the companies maintain themselves. So DOJ and the SEC are again now putting pressure on companies, and this is a fairly recent amendment to the corporate enforcement program as well. How are you, company, getting control over this ephemeral messaging? So in the broader compliance context, I think that's one of the other things that folks should think about. A little bit of a detour from whistleblowing, but it all kind of falls into that bucket of, how am I promoting compliance within my company consistent with what I might need under the corporate enforcement policy?
Thank you, Rich. And I think we have one last question for the two of you. and then, if time permits, we'll let a couple of minutes for, to see if anyone in the audience wants to ask something. But for some time now, and everyone in the audience probably knows this, hotlines and mechanisms to, internally report misconduct have become commonplace in corporations, especially in large corporations, right? Now, obviously, DOJ wants to see these hotlines as mechanisms, but probably all of us who have done a lot of work with companies using these mechanisms know that some tips are good, but a lot of tips are not that good.
Yeah.
And now DOJ is because of the incentive it's creating for whistleblowers to come forward. Obviously, at the same time, it's putting a lot of pressure on companies to take tips even more seriously than it was the case before, perhaps, right?
Mm-hmm.
So do you see any concerns with that in terms of resources, timing?
That's a great point, and this follows up perfectly with what Widge was saying, which is, we don't know now. Right? If you're a company executive, you don't know. A lot of times, when you look at statistics, as Widge was, and every company, any executive who's here listening to us knows that, when you have a robust internal mechanism for a hotline, a tip line, a website internally that you can go to, you're going to get a lot of claims, and at times a lot of them are baseless. There are employees that are disgruntled. They leave or they're fired for good cause, but then they submit something anonymously. And I'm sure Widge has seen this over and over again, and they submit something anonymously to the hotline, talking about some sort of fraud that occurred, but then there's no backup, no details, no information, and then you respond to the whistleblower anonymously, of course, without any retaliation, and then you get more information that doesn't really lead anywhere. Now, with this fear, let's say, or that a whistleblower can jump the gun and go to DOJ and have DOJ start an investigation, that could really cause companies to have to spend potentially a lot more time, resources, manpower to investigate and document. Remember, always document whatever you are looking into, even if it's baseless. Always good to have in case it ever comes back to you. You looked into it, you responded, even if it's an anonymous complaint. Make sure that you create a file or a memo that you tried. And sometimes, in my experience, I'm sure Widges as well, the company will respond to an anonymous tip, a whistleblower, and then you get no response back, nothing. And you're asking them for basic information. We want to know how this happened, tell us where to look. Sometimes the complaints are so vague and so without any facts or details that you have nowhere to start. And that's good to show the government in case later on, you get a knock on the door and you can say, listen, yeah, we got this tip. This tip didn't tell us anything. We responded. We asked for follow-up information and we got nothing. Have that, documented, please, because I've seen way too many instances where companies try to do the right thing, but then a year or two will go by and everybody forgets or people have left. And then you're like, oh, I don't know. I think we did. We're not sure if we looked into it. So this is going to be a very interesting thing. And I hope that DOJ, as this progresses, will, in order to avoid these types of issues and problems. And by the way, Deputy Attorney General Monaco, in today's announcement, did say that they're going to be looking into this, kind of evaluating how this gets rolled out, because I think there's going to have to be a little bit more delineation and parameters that DOJ can give companies about what types of eligible information will qualify under the whistleblower information, not just a disgruntled employee that comes forward perhaps with no evidence and no facts and just makes really, outlandish accusations. Remember, today's announcement centers on 4 new corporate areas that the department, Widge and I talked about the ones that already exist, but the ones that they're now filling the gap is on foreign corruption, Widge talked about that. But when I say foreign corruption, these are companies that are not issuers. Because the SEC, remember I told you the SEC has a whistleblower, but that's only for companies that are registered. For other private companies that are being alleged to have committed foreign corruption, that now this program applies to them. It applies to bribes being committed here in the US, so not foreign bribes, but domestic bribes. Healthcare fraud cases for private health insurers, because there is a program, you know, under the key TAMs for federal programs, but how about private insurance that are being deprived, defrauded, where the government can bring in some fraudulent claims against them. And then you've also got financial institutions, you know, cases where let's assume that a cryptocurrency exchange program is using coming into the US, but without registering or complying with US laws. Those types of cases are now the types of fraudulent cases that the department wants whistleblowers to come forward. Now, those are like some of the gaps, so to speak.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to what Willie said. I think it's, as a whistleblower hotline evolves and you get more and more complaints, the key is to have a good triage mechanism in place, including what is going to be privileged, especially if, you know, you're a subsidiary of a US company and you have to think about the US attorney-client privilege as well. What will be privileged, what will not be privileged, because the initial whistleblows are not privileged conversations unless it would, you know, happen to be to somebody in the legal department of the company and outside the hotline. I think you'll find 85–90% of them are, you know, this person keeps using my coffee mug, right? This person took my parking spot, or, you know, or HR related that can kind of immediately be moved over into HR, not that they don't need to be dealt with. To Willie's point, on the others, that there might not really kind of be any real traction or substance when you start looking into it, documenting what you, as Willie said, what you did, but also what you didn't do. I find that's often the hardest to remember if you didn't document it several years down the road, is why didn't we look at these other three people's emails? Why didn't we do this, right? And you had very good, logical, defensible reasons at the time. And then 3 years later, that's very, very hard to remember. I think the dynamic, and I'm just guessing here because we'll have to see how this dynamic really plays out, is more along the lines of what Willie was saying, that you'll do a good, on those type of cases, you'll do a, you know, brief but good internal investigation that's defensible and wait it out. The government will always say, come to us and let us decide, but that gets risky on the cost benefit side, because you're then likely to get a lot of document requests. You're going to be providing a lot of information. You're going to be spending money on people like us, and nothing may come of it at the end of the day. So we'll have to see how this all plays out. But I think Willie's points were just outstanding about looking into it seriously, but documenting it, and, you know, see how it shakes out.
Well, which those are actually great points. You know, to the, and actually, you know, I was just checking our chat to see what kind of questions we're getting from the audience, and you know, two of our good friends, Julio Cesar from Rouge and Manuel Cerantes, actually posed the same question. I mean, I think it's concerning for everyone who works inside of a company, the fact that any information is a tip and any information needs to be followed to the end. But moving more to the government side, where resources are even more limited than, you know, they are inside of companies in the private sector. When I was quickly looking at the new policy for the whistleblower program, I haven't seen anything like this, but it seems that every sort of information is welcome. There are no sort of parameters of saying, hey, your testimony enough is not, you know, it's not just sufficient. You know, you need to bring some hard evidence, some documents that actually supports, that independently verifies what you're saying, right? I can understand why DOJ does not want to limit the type of admissible information, The SEC has not done it. The CFTC has not done it. The IRS has not done it. But what are your thoughts about that? Would it be advisable for the government, even if it is in non-exhaustive fashion, to sort of like lay out some parameters as to what qualifies as good information, bad information, like maybe to send a message out there to potential whistleblowers to say, if this is all you have, don't even bother.
Yeah, I think there's some guidelines, and often you see this with companies' internal guidelines on it, that, is the whistleblow retaliatory? Like somebody, was it done with malicious intent, right? So if there's nothing there, but it was done with malicious intent, obviously there are, federal crimes that can address that. But I think some guidelines just along the lines of all information must be brought in good faith, and we'd like you to be able to back it up, right? Not just, I saw this, but it would be helpful to the government, right, if you could provide us with certain specifics as you go through it.
Yeah,
but if they're going to follow up, sorry, Will, go
agree.
ahead.
No, I'm sorry. No, I agree 100%. And look, when we were both prosecutors, getting tips is not new for the government, right? Tips come in all different ways. And like you said, Marcelo, the resources are limited. Everybody thinks the government will investigate every single thing. Well, not so. It depends on how the evidence is presented. If a whistleblower comes to the government with nothing other than just a suspicion or an allegation, but like Which said, you've got to have certain parameters and something in place that sort of you're playing triage. So the government too, because you only have so many agents and so many ways that you can investigate. The whistleblower that really has knowledge that can come forward with hard evidence or point the government in the right direction. But it's got to be meaningful. It's got to be something that is not just an assumption or a guess, because if that's all the government is getting, the government has way too many other cases. So that's something that is going to have to be laid out or dealt with, I guess. Now the government's going to have they're going to have to get some more people just to answer the phone and take these calls, because I mean, we're talking about, like I said, 4 new areas of corporate crime that are now they're opening the door for people of all types of employees to come forward to get a reward. So it's a lot of work.
I agree with you both, and hopefully they just don't raise our taxes to hire those additional folks.
It could be self-funding, Marcelo, right?
right, exactly. But I think our time is up. So I Fernando and I wanted to thank you both for your time, for being so kind, and for helping us here today. I think it was great. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to say before we end.
Just thank you to both of you and all the people that participated in this webinar. I think it was really interesting to understand deeply this new program. And I was talking to several clients and compliance colleagues in which they mentioned that if we check the data during the last 2 or 3 years, FCPA cases were not that hard as in the past. So I think this program is coming in a perfect timing and to reinforce all the good things that were happening in the region in terms of compliance. And we are very happy to see how this evolves. So just thank you to everyone.
The pleasure.
Thank you for having us. It was great.
Thank you.
Have a good night. Bye.
Take care, all. Thank you.
Bye-bye.